Okay, continuing with part two. I apologize, cut off in the middle of a sentence trying to use a good camera for you guys, and it cuts off after 11 and a half minutes. So what I was talking about is we were talking about the Immigration Act of 1924 very much limits European immigration, but ironically, especially when you think about the rhetoric we hear today, is we still had unrestricted immigration within the Western Hemisphere, meaning that anyone in the Western Hemisphere, North America, Central America, South America, the Bahamas, the Caribbean, those people could freely come to the United States. They did not have to worry about any type of quota. Now, one thing we had talked about, this is the time period where we had stopped all Asian immigration. Starting with the Chinese Immigration Act, really in the late 1800s, and then finally we banned all Asian immigration. Eventually, we will allow only 185,000 European immigrants per year, and then we will reduce it later to 150,000. Ironically, we allowed more immigrants from Northern Europe than other parts of Europe. Kind of racism will play a role in this. Strangely, because we had just fought a war against them, Germany actually received the highest quota of people who were allowed to come here. Now, we were very concerned at the time about the Russian Revolution, and that's kind of understandable because we didn't really understand how incompetent they would be. And two, their whole big thing about Marxism was that they were waiting for the worldwide revolution, so they really were trying to export the communist revolution. So there was a concern. However, and to combat that, the Justice Department would arrest and deport alien anarchists and communists. Now, while we were focused on communists, what we really needed to be focused on were these anarchists. Because at least with communists, they have meetings and you can kind of like get into those meetings and find out. Anarchists, there's no anarchy clubs. They are kind of the lone wolves. They are the ones who act alone. And frankly, they were probably the biggest threat that we faced at the time. And their big problem is they basically think all government is corrupt. They want to bring down the entire system. Which, you know, when you're 15 sounds great, but as you get to my age, you realize how terribly stupid it is. In fact, anarchists actually set off dynamite in front of the Attorney General's house one time. Another time, fortunately, there was a very astute mailman. Someone had tried to basically mail a bunch of mail bombs out of a public postal box. Fortunately, the mailman had noticed ticking. So that was really good. The Attorney General's, by the way, was at the time, and you don't need to really remember this, but just for completion, his name was A. Mitchell Palmer. He's actually kind of an interesting guy in his beliefs and things. See, we talked about the Scopes trial. Now, this is we're going to kind of get into the heavy part of the 1920s. We're going to kind of talk about civil rights and racial violence. So we talked about how African American soldiers had gone to Europe and they have found a more racially tolerant Europe than what they had here. And many did come back and try to fight for civil rights, and this was a very difficult time for that in this country. Between 1880 and 1930, lynch mobs killed almost 5,000 African Americans and other minorities. To put it another way, that was 2 people being lynched and killed a week. Now, I want to show you what may be one of the most disturbing images I had ever come across in a textbook. And I'm going to get my sister to make sure that it gets kind of up there. Now, the KKK had basically been rubbed out during Reconstruction, but it will make a major comeback in the late 19 teens, early 20s. Now, a lot of people are often surprised where the KKK kind of reconstituted. A lot of people usually guess Tennessee or Kentucky or some other southern state. Where it reconstitutes really is Indiana, which is weird because Indiana only had about a 6% African American population. Yet over 50% of the white population of Indiana during this time actually belonged to the KKK. I guess what I'm saying is Indiana has some problems. What the picture I showed you is from a lynching in Marion, Indiana. This picture was actually sold as a postcard, so it was a souvenir. And actually at lynchings, people would keep souvenirs, jewelry, and they would actually cut into the bodies and keep body parts as a souvenir as well. What always kind of disturbed me about this picture is just how some of the people are just kind of really mugging for the camera, and just seem to be really happy to be there as they're doing this really horrible things. Now, usually this occurred after there were some sort of trumped up charges against African Americans. The worst period was called the Red Summer of 1919. 43 African Americans were killed during that time. What you're going to see is the use of organized violence to hurt African Americans economically and to make sure they don't vote. They will attack black businesses and members of the middle class. They will destroy the homes of the black community in Tulsa in 1921 and Rosewood, Florida in 1923. Now, how bad was it in Tulsa? The headline in the newspaper the morning of the lynchings was, and this was the banner headline on there, was, quote, "To lynch a Negro tonight." So everybody was in on this. Now in both Tulsa and Rosewood, African Americans fought back. This just made the white crowds even angrier, and they burned their communities to the ground. Tulsa declared martial law. They imprisoned half of the black community in internment camps. After that, 1,000 families lived in a tent city during the winter before they could begin rebuilding their community. Now, I will say this for Florida, and there's not a lot of good things I can ever say about Florida because Florida is Florida. In 1994, the Florida government gave the survivors of the Rosewood incident, crime, $150,000 each. So, good job, Florida. The NAACP wanted to make lynching a federal crime. This was blocked by Southern congressmen. The claim was that it inhibited states' rights and the ability for states to do their own law enforcement. Fun fact, do you know when we finally passed a federal anti-lynching law? About 5 months ago. That is the first time that it has actually been a federal crime to lynch someone. Everybody see the cats. So, and I misspoke earlier. When I was talking about Indiana, the black population of Indiana was 3%, yet half of the white population belonged to the KKK. In all areas of the country, there were 3 to 6 million members of the KKK throughout the 1920s. What they wanted was white Protestant supremacy. They often marched under a banner that said 100% Americanism. In 1925, the Klan wanted to march on D.C. Obviously, the City Council of Washington, D.C. did not want that to happen. So what they did is they passed a law that said if you want to march, if you're an adult, you can't cover your face. It's kind of one of the reasons we have that law for Halloween that basically says adults can't wear masks anymore, and so you can thank the KKK for that. Now, what they thought would happen is that the members of the KKK would be so ashamed that they would not want to show their faces, but in actuality, and take a look at this picture from the steps of the U.S. Capitol. they were proud to, do I have this lined up well? They were actually proud to march without, I think this cat is drinking my drink. Let me hand that to my sister and save my drink here. They were actually proud to show their faces because they were true believers in this cause. Alright, thank you much. Alright. I should work with animals more often. Oh, I'm going to show one more picture here in a second. Forgot about this guy. As fears begin to subside in the 1920s, we'll also see the Klan subside. Membership in the Klan will begin to decline, fortunately. Now, during this time, as I said, this is kind of the beginnings of the civil rights movement. And there is a lot of talk on how do African Americans, how can they help themselves economically. And there frankly will be a big divide in this. We talked before about Frederick Douglass, or not Frederick, Booker T. Washington, excuse me. So, you know, we've already talked about how there's definitely a different view between the North and the South. And even within the North, there is not agreement on how to do this. We kind of talked about W.E.B. Du Bois before in his opposition to a lot of what Booker T. Washington was doing. But there was this other guy named Marcus Garvey who wanted to empower African Americans economically. He will create